The Americans, Chapter 18, America Claims an Empire, Section 2, The Spanish-American War. In early 1896, James Creelman traveled to Cuba as a New York World reporter, covering the Second Cuban War for Independence from Spain. While in Havana, he wrote columns about his observations of the war. His description of Spanish atrocities aroused American sympathy for Cubans. A personal voice, James Creelman. No man's life, no man's property is safe in Cuba. American citizens are imprisoned or slain without cause. American property is destroyed on all sides. Wounded soldiers can be found begging in the streets of Havana. The horrors of a barbarous struggle for the extermination of the native population are witnessed in all parts of the country. Blood on the roadsides, blood in the fields, blood on the doorsteps, blood, blood, blood. There is no nation wise enough, brave enough to aid in this blood-smitten land. Newspapers during that period often exaggerated stories like Creelman's to boost their sales, as well as to provoke American intervention in Cuba. Part 1. Cubans rebel against Spain. By the end of the 19th century, Spain, once the most powerful colonial nation on earth, had lost most of its colonies. It retained only the Philippines and the island of Guam in the Pacific, a few outposts in Africa, and the Caribbean islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Americas. American interest in Cuba. The United States had long held an interest in Cuba, which lies only 90 miles south of Florida. In 1854, diplomats recommended to President Franklin Pierce that the United States buy Cuba from Spain. The Spanish responded by saying that they would rather see Cuba sunk in the ocean, but American interest in Cuba continued. When the Cubans rebelled against Spain between 1868 and 1878, American sympathies went out to the Cuban people. The Cuban revolt against Spain was not successful, but in 1886 the Cuban people did force Spain to abolish slavery. After the emancipation of Cuba's slaves, American capitalists began investing millions of dollars in large sugarcane plantations on the island. The Second War for Independence. Anti-Spanish sentiment in Cuba soon erupted into a second war for independence. José Martí, a Cuban poet and journalist in exile in New York, launched a revolution in 1895. Martí organized Cuban resistance against Spain, using an active guerrilla campaign and deliberately destroying property, especially American-owned sugar mills and plantations. Martí counted on provoking U.S. intervention to help the rebels achieve Cuba Libre, a free Cuba. Public opinion in the United States was split. Many business people wanted the government to support Spain in order to protect their investments. Other Americans, however, were enthusiastic about the rebel cause. The cry, Cuba Libre, was, after all, similar in sentiment to Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death." Part 2. War fever escalates. In 1896, Spain responded to the Cuban revolt by sending General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba to restore order. Weyler tried to crush the rebellion by herding the entire rural population of central and western Cuba into barbed wire concentration camps. Here, civilians could not give aid to rebels. An estimated 300,000 Cubans filled these camps, where thousands died from hunger and disease. Headline wars. Weyler's actions fueled a war over newspaper circulation that had developed between the American newspaper tycoons William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. To lure readers, Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's New York World printed exaggerated accounts by reporters such as James Creelman of Butcher Weyler's brutality. Stories of poisoned wells and of children being thrown to the sharks deepened American sympathies for the rebels. This sensational style of writing, which exaggerates the news to lure and enrage readers, became known as yellow journalism. Hearst and Pulitzer fanned war fever. When Hearst sent the gifted artist Frederick Remington to Cuba to draw sketches of reporters' stories, Remington informed the publisher that the war between the United States and Spain seemed very unlikely. Hearst reportedly replied, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." The Delaunay Letter. American sympathy for Cuba Libre grew with each day's headlines. When President William McKinley took office in 1897, demands for American intervention in Cuba were on the rise. Preferring to avoid war with Spain, McKinley tried diplomatic means to resolve the crisis. At first, his efforts appeared to succeed. Spain recalled General Weyler, modified the policy regarding concentration camps, and offered Cuba limited self-government. In February 1898, however, the New York Journal published a private letter written by Enrique Dupuy de Lome, a Spanish minister to the United States. A Cuban rebel had stolen the letter from a Havana post office and leaked it to the newspaper, which was thirsty for scandal. The Delaunay letter criticized President McKinley, calling him weak and a bidder of the admiration of the crowd. The embarrassed Spanish government apologized, and the minister resigned. Still, Americans were angry over the insult to their president. The USS Maine explodes. Only a few days after the publication of the Delaunay letter, American resentment towards Spain turned to outrage. Early in 1898, President McKinley had ordered the USS Maine to Cuba to bring home American citizens in danger from the fighting and to protect American property. On February 15, 1898, the ship blew up in the harbor of Havana. More than 260 men were killed. At the time, no one really knew why the ship exploded. However, American newspapers claimed that the Spanish had blown up the ship. The journal's headline read, "The warship Maine was split in two by an enemy's secret infernal machine." Hearst's paper offered a reward of $50,000 for the capture of the Spaniards who supposedly had committed the outrage. Part 3. War with Spain erupts. Now there was no holding back the forces that wanted war. "Remember the Maine!" became the rallying cry for U.S. intervention in Cuba. It made no difference that the Spanish government agreed on April 9th to almost everything the United States demanded, including a 6-month ceasefire. Despite the Spanish concessions, public opinion favored war. On April 11th, McKinley asked Congress for authority to use force against Spain. After a week of debate, Congress agreed, and on April 20th, the United States declared war. The war in the Philippines. The Spanish thought the Americans would invade Cuba, but the first battle of the war took place in a Spanish colony on the other side of the world, the Philippine Islands. On April 30th, the American fleet in the Pacific steamed for the Philippines. The next morning, Commodore George Dewey gave the command to open fire on the Spanish fleet at Manila, the Philippine capital. Within hours, Dewey's men had destroyed every Spanish ship there. Dewey's victory allowed U.S. troops to land in the Philippines. Dewey had the support of the Filipinos, who, like the Cubans, also wanted freedom from Spain. Over the next 2 months, 11,000 Americans joined forces with Filipino rebels, led by Emilio Aguinaldo. In August, Spanish troops in Manila surrendered to the United States. The war in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, hostilities began with a naval blockade of Cuba. Admiral William T. Sampson effectively sealed up the Spanish fleet in the harbor of Santiago de Cuba. Dewey's victory at Manila had demonstrated the superiority of the United States naval forces. In contrast, the Army maintained only a small professional force, supplemented by a large, inexperienced, and ill-prepared volunteer force. About 125,000 Americans had volunteered to fight. The new soldiers were sent to the training camps that lacked inadequate supplies and effective leaders. Moreover, there were not enough modern guns to go around, and the troops were outfitted with heavy woolen uniforms unsuitable for Cuba's tropical climate. In addition, the officers, most of whom were Civil War veterans, had a tendency to spend their time recalling their war experiences rather than training the volunteers. Rough Riders. Despite these handicaps, American forces landed in Cuba in June of 1898 and began to converge on the port city of Santiago. The army of 17,000 included four African-American regiments of the regular army and the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry under the command of Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, a New Yorker, had given up his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to lead the group of volunteers. He would later become President of the United States. The most famous land battle in Cuba took place near Santiago on July 1st. The first part of the battle, on nearby Kettle Hill, featured a dramatic uphill charge by the Rough Riders and two African-American regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalries. Their victory cleared the way for an infantry attack on the strategically important San Juan Hill. Although Roosevelt and his units played only a minor role in the second victory, U.S. newspapers declared him the hero of San Juan Hill. 2 days later, the Spanish fleet tried to escape the American blockade of the harbor at Santiago. The naval battle that followed along the Cuban coast ended in the destruction of the Spanish fleet. On the heels of this victory, American troops invaded Puerto Rico on July 25th. Treaty of Paris. The United States and Spain signed an armistice, a ceasefire agreement, on August 12th, ending what Secretary of State John Hay called a splendid little war. The actual fighting in the war had lasted only 15 weeks. On December 10, 1898, the United States and Spain met in Paris to agree on a treaty. At the peace talks, Spain freed Cuba and turned over the islands of Guam in the Pacific and Puerto Rico in the West Indies to the United States. Spain also sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Debate over the treaty. The Treaty of Paris touched off a great debate in the United States. Arguments centered on whether or not the United States had the right to annex the Philippines, but imperialism was the real issue. President McKinley told a group of Methodist ministers that he had prayed for guidance on Philippine annexation and had concluded that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all, the Philippine Islands, and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and Christianize them. McKinley's need to justify imperialism may have clouded his memory. Most Filipinos had been Christian for centuries. Other prominent Americans presented a variety of arguments, political, moral, and economic, against annexation. Some felt the treaty violated the Declaration of Independence by denying self-government to the newly acquired territories. The African-American educator Booker T. Washington argued that the United States should settle race-related issues at home before taking on social problems elsewhere. The labor leader Samuel Gompers feared that Filipino immigrants would compete for American jobs. On February 6, 1899, the annexation question was settled when the Senate's approval of the Treaty of Paris. The United States now had an empire that included Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The next question Americans faced was how and when the United States would add to its dominion.